Welcome, everybody. This is the second episode of Solidari-Tea, which is the Resource Center's podcast at UC Santa Cruz. And this episode is going to be focused on, or its theme is Black Lives Matter, perspectives from the AAPI community. So I will be your host, MK. I'm actually a recent graduate of UC Santa Cruz, and I work for the front desk. And here with me is my lovely tech support, Mel. And we have some guests today on the show to talk about the movement for Black lives and Black liberation and perspectives from the Asian American Pacific Islander community. As a disclaimer, the perspectives that are shared through this podcast are that of the individuals and not in do not represent like the perspectives officially from the Ethnic Resource Center or the resource centers at the UC Santa Cruz. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and have our guests introduce themselves for today's episode. Can we start with Cami?
Yes. Hi, y'all. Thank you so much for inviting me and my friend to do this. My name is Cami Shigaya. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I just graduated from Santa Cruz with a BA in legal studies and also a BA in community studies. This past year, I was a lead intern for the Asian American Pacific Islander Resource Center.
Hello, everyone. My name is Srija. I use she or hers pronouns. I was also a lead intern at the Asian American Pacific Islander Resource Center this past year, and I'm also a recent graduate with a BA in intensive psychology and a BS in cognitive science.
Hey, go ahead, Solo.
Okay, bring it over to me. Hey, y'all. My name is Solomon Kanehailua. I go by Solo. You can call me Solomon. Whatever works for you, I'll answer to both. I am a recent UCSC film and digital media graduate. I just graduated a few weeks ago, last week. I don't know, time is an illusion right now, but I just graduated. I identify as Native Hawaiian and also Mexican, but mostly Native Hawaiian. That's what I grew up with. That's what I know most about, and that is what I am most familiar with. A few things about me. I do like food, as I am eating Chinese Korean rice right now as we speak. And I think this is a really cool thing to do. Like, this is my first podcast. This is a really cool thing that needs to be discussed. And I'm really thankful and honored to have Mac run it. Thank you for your flexibility. I know this has taken a very long time for us to become together as one to talk about this. But hello, I'm Solo. I'm going to pass it on to Lexi.
I am Alexandria Laluifi Sailua, but I do go by Lexi. I am also a graduate. I'll be graduating fall quarter, but still 2020 period. I'm a part of the Asian Pacific Islander Student Alliance, aka PISA, and it really is a great honor to be here right now. This isn't my first podcast, but this is one that I'm very excited to be a part of again. Excitement is the mood right now. But yeah, that's me, and I'll give it back to Mac.
Thank you for being here. So much big brain energy. I'm really excited.
Truly.
So we have a couple of questions set up. The first question is, how have you seen racism, specifically anti-Black racism, right, embodied in your own communities? And on the flip side of that, like, how have you seen acts of solidarity and unity? And what were you taught from your parents or relatives, communities, and even the education system about race?
Lately, I have been seeing a lot of really, really incredible Japanese Americans working for equality and solidarity with the Black community. And there is a group called Zudu for Change, or Zudu for Solidarity, and they were speaking out when the detention centers, those are still ongoing, but when they were the focal point of the media, they were really involved in there. And so a lot of these people tend to be a lot younger and also of later generations, right? Like third, fourth generations of Japanese Americans. And generally not first or second generation. And I think part of that, you know, it's certainly not to speak for all of them, but I think some of that has to do with internment camp. And my grandparents were all interned. My grandfather fought for the US in World War II in the 442nd Regiment, which was an all Japanese American regiment. And I think a lot of the reason why the JA community has tried to be supportive is because they know that, you know, like our family histories have been erased and we've lost, you know, countless, you know, tangible items and memories, but also language and culture and tradition and ritual. And I think really empathize with others who have felt the same thing of a tearing away of your culture without, you know, without your consent, and in a really egregious and violent way. And so, I mean, I think that it's important that we find our own people who also think similarly to us. Like, I think all of these groups are really incredible, but I also think that, you know, we have a lot to learn as a group. We do. And we need to be open and honest and confront our own biases in our own families, with our own friends, in our own communities. And, you know, hopefully help in some way.
Yeah, I think to just add on to y'all's points is like, when we think about where really the roots of like anti-Blackness or racism come into our own country, oftentimes come from like roots of colonialism or imperialism. Because, for example, in the Filipino community, as the Philippines was like colonized by Spain, which obviously introduced things like class association with colorism, um, uh, the Philippines would then become a colonial project of America. And so in that moment of time of being a colony of the United States, of course, racism is then introduced and taught, and white supremacy is validated through that. And so when Filipinos don't have any contact or experience being around like African American or Black people, and they come here, literally the history and the culture has been impacted by white supremacy in that very particular way. So I think like, to your point, like Cami and Shrija, about like the difference then of like generations, like confronting that and unlearning that, is really important when we talk about like diaspora.
For my culture specifically, like people, what is the word I'm trying to, people mistake respect and the idea of speaking out. I don't know if that makes sense, like in terms of like, if you speak out, you're considered disrespectful. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so there was that, like being taught that. I was like, you know, I was considered the kind of like mouthy kid, and my mom, low-key, I still am that mouthy kid, but like my mom was always like, you gotta stop being disrespectful, like don't be talking out of turn or speak only when spoken to. And I'm like, but why we live in this life? Like, why is this okay? Like, just because it happens a lot doesn't mean it's okay. And like, just that idea of like, you're mistaking me asking a question as disrespectful when I'm really trying to get to the root of why we do the things we do. And that just like that idea of silence is respect really pisses me off.
Yeah.
Just because we are in a place right now where Black Lives Matter, that is a movement that's continuing to happen. And I feel like I'm getting a lot of hate from my own family.
Yeah.
Shout out to y'all. I don't like, I'm just getting a lot of backlash of like, why are you
Good word
speaking
for
on
it.
things? Yeah, you know, like, why are you speaking on these things? You should just, you know, keep your mouth shut. Like, don't add to the chaos. And I'm like, okay, first of all, like, we need to talk in order to be heard and understood. So if you're not understanding what I'm saying, then you're clearly not, like, you're using respect as a term of control.
Mm-hmm.
And that is just not what I'm standing for in terms of power and the dynamics of power becoming abuse. And that's kind of like all I've got right now. So if Solo wants to hop on.
No, I really like how you put respect and control together, because that's really what most of our culture is all about. Because our culture is, well, as a Native Hawaiian and as I've known Native Hawaiian history, it's a forgotten history. No one talks about it. Like in throughout K through 12, it's referenced that Hawaiian history in Hawaii was there, but it's more so talked about in this context of colonialism and annexation and how it became a state, not like what it was before. Hawaii used to be a monarchy, and it used to have a lot of really interesting mythologies and science behind it. But since like no one talks about it, it's really hard to kind of teach that thing and kind of pass on this history that we have onto the next generation, because it's getting harder and harder to delve into the root of our culture, but more so to transition back to respect and control. A lot of Hawaiian culture and a lot of Polynesian culture in general. I took a Pacific Island arts class when I first transferred here, and we were talking about the art and what they represent, and a lot of it is all about community. However, there is a hierarchy. I personally, I have been taught to always respect your elders, because your elders are the ones that have brought you here. Your elders are the ones that care for you, that love you. So you should love and respect them, because it's a practice, how we practice aloha. Aloha means hello, goodbye, I love, yeah. But it's more so, aloha is really more about, I love you, I'll care for you. And it's not even like a question of like, do you love me and do you care for me in return? It's like, period, point blank. I love you, you love me, you care for me, you care, and vice versa. Because the ability to practice that is really where we should be what we should be doing, rather than just having like a hierarchical thing of like, oh, I'm higher than you. You can't say this because I told you to say this. Like, no, you should actually embrace why people are asking such things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
I feel like y'all are pointing onto like a really good point, which is like, sometimes love is like challenging and pushing, those questions, because you genuine, well, like, of course, first of all, it's like love for that love and like that want for justice for like the Black community, like that is it in itself, right? And then it's, I also want folks in my family, like folks close to me, to understand that, and I want them to, like step in the uncomfortability with me in that, because I love you and I want you to grow from that. And like, and sometimes I think y'all are definitely right. Like, saying, like talking back to your family, like standing up for yourselves like that.
That's intimidating.
It really intimidating. Yeah, and it's hard, but I think like there's like a really great point that you mentioned, Solo. It's like, like what has silence done for our community? Really, like silence. Like silence is how we forget who we are, how we forget our values, how we don't hold ourselves accountable. you know, and
Mm-hmm.
so I really feel y'all on that, where it's like it's not the time to be silent, and it's not the time,
Yeah.
not it isn't really okay for, like, you're right, like that thing of like respect and control to be paired together, but especially
Mm-hmm.
with, like, an issue like Black Lives Matter, like it's not the time to be twisting culture into
Mm-hmm.
ways for like conservative value.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Hmm.
for sure.
I
That's
definitely
And
agree with y'all. Like,
yeah.
I think for, gosh, I just lost it. The idea of silence, like, oh yeah, got it. um, just came back. um, yeah, the idea that respect turns into or transforms into this idea of silence and control, it definitely stems from white supremacy and imperialism, especially like within the missionization of my island specifically. I found that connection of like, you know what, like, this is how the colonizers got to us, is like, this is the way, this is the life, you know, um follow this and that, and like what you're doing is wrong. And just like, because my culture is so fluid, they found a way to say that structure is amazing, and yes, structure helps, but in this way it was very the structure they built was one to continue to silence us. And like, for my parents and my grandparents and like all the ancestors that have become before me after missionization have learned that silence is the way. When y'all speak about love, like, that is the one thing that comes to mind is revolutionary love. That idea that accountability is the highest and the most powerful form of love. um and just,
True. Hmm.
yeah, like, we have voices today, and we've been taught that our voices aren't as powerful, which as a rebellious child, like, I was like, no, you're not gonna tell me that.
Yeah.
You are not telling me today that I do not matter. But like, kind of highlighting on that is like, today is the day to speak up. And I feel like a lot of our trauma, a lot of our curses, and a lot of our, I guess, internalized hate is showing up more and more. But what I also see is that revolutionary love showing up
Hmm.
even harder within ourselves. Like, look at this group right now. I see so much potential in all of us, and I know we can make a change. I've seen us make a change, whether it's super small or whether it's very large. But each and every move that we make, I feel like we've gotten closer and closer to that goal of
Hmm.
love and justice and equity, which is what the Black Lives Matter movement is about. It's holding folks accountable of what love
Hmm.
should really look like across the whole entire board. And so,
Exactly.
yeah, I'm for it. I'm here.
Hmm.
You know, like, I'm here showing up to see what that means and what that looks like for our generation, because I want to make sure, like, when we do leave this earth into another realm, whatever we may believe in, that those who come after us know for a fact that they have the tools and resources and the support to continue this movement.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely. Movement is definitely the consistent thing, especially like in history. Like we're always moving towards something because this
Mm-hmm.
world is a very, very scary place. And the fact that
Yes.
you brought up revolutionary love really took me back to this time when this woman, her name is Teresa Siakatono, she did a little
Hey.
leadership retreat earlier this quarter.
Mm-hmm.
She was talking about revolutionary love and what it means. And what I remember was it's like love. She really emphasized love. And what I
Mm-hmm.
remember from that talk was revolutionary love helps us align. No, love always aligns itself, whether
Mm-hmm.
it means like you hold them accountable because you should hold someone accountable for their wrongdoings, or why they didn't do what they were supposed to be doing. Because when you hold someone accountable, it's getting an eye level of why we are not holding our responsibility. There's a Hawaiian word for that. It's called kuleana. It's like how we reciprocate our responsibilities onto others and how we can pass it on to the later generation. And the idea of revolutionary love, especially in this day and age, it's like it really embeds not just Black Lives Matter, but like also brown lives and all lives do not matter until Black Lives Matter, because we are all interconnected in one way or form. And I think looking at history, looking at colonialism, imperialism, manifest destiny, like all of that, we're all connected some way, somehow, because we all have common things to share. We all have differences, but we all have something to share. And the reason that we can come together and be at a high level is because we're interconnected. Our liberation is pretty much bound by one another.
Exactly.
People like coming together and organizing is probably the biggest thing that we should be doing, because what does it mean to be like exclusive? Oh, we're specifically Pacific Islanders, so we should only, as Pacific Islanders, come together and fight for our only thing. When really, it should be everybody should come together and help us. And then once we're helped, we should still stay together to help each other as well. I think that's the problem. Like, I'm going on a tangent, I'm sorry, but I just think we need to stop being more individual and start being more communal. Does that make sense?
Yes.
No,
that all makes sense.
Yeah.
We all come from different backgrounds of different sort of like immigrant diaspora communities. What then became really significant turning points for yourself in understanding that the fight for Black lives, as a person of my like community background, like why is it necessary that I participate in this? Yeah. Anybody can go.
Okay, yeah, well, I mean, so the Black Lives Matter movement, I think, at least from my understanding and from what I've seen it, like how I've seen it grow, it seems like it started for me when I was like in high school. So around like 2013, 2014 is when I first started like hearing that term and hearing it being used to talk about some of the police brutality killings of a lot of people throughout the country at the time, and also just talking about like Flint, Michigan and the water and in a lot of different situations. Michael Brown, like those kinds of things, Oscar Grant, like those are some of the names that I was hearing when I first started hearing about the Black Lives Matter movement. And I was really lucky to have a really incredible history teacher in high school who really pushed for us to learn about not just all of the ways that the country tends to parade itself and pride itself on all of the accomplishments that it has, which is typical, I think, of a lot of textbooks that are US history related. And oh, sorry, I should mention, she was a US history teacher, and she was like, I don't want to use a textbook, don't use a textbook. And we would do our own stuff and like look at articles that she brought up and talk about things from different perspectives. And she really forced us and pushed us to like think outside of the box and think outside of what is typical of like, whatever California state curriculum. And in that, we watched a lot of videos about that, about Black Lives Matter, and talked a lot about it. And it was really eye-opening because it was, first of all, I think the first like history teacher I had that was not conservative, which was new to me. And it was really eye-opening to see all of the ways in which our media portrayal of Black people in these instances did not necessarily match up the actual facts of the matter.
I can say similarly that in my high school we read I think it's Alexandria Smith's The New Jim Crow, and we just like tore that book apart. And then and it's a book that talks about how with the 13th Amendment, slavery is still technically legalized through like prisons. And in my school, Michelle Alexander. Sorry, thank you for that, Kimmy. And I like mixed it up. Okay. And for me, like really thinking about there's this, and then the term that came up a lot was like school to prison pipeline, right? And in my neighborhood, I didn't end up going to this high school, but my home high school in Sacramento, um, Rosemont High School is directly across on the street to a juvie. And it's one of the largest like juvenile like prisons like in the county. And so it was just like so blatant. It's like here's a high school in a neighborhood that is ethnically diverse and has working class families in it, and like here's literally a jail for people of that age. And so reading the new Jim Crow, it was just like, how can I literally ignore this? This is my neighborhood. Like I pass by this thing to go to the post office, right? And like really thinking structurally how like these things play into each other. Like it just couldn't not think about that. So yeah, and like I think that really does show to the importance of education, like in high school. Like obviously, kids are capable of having conversations about race, and I think a lot of times we try to shield them from that. But they're, like kids can definitely recognize like differences in people, pick up on racial biases at a really young age. And even to talk about race in high school, I think is actually way too late. And so I think like, I like how you bring up education a lot, because that is like a really important part of it. And when our education fails to talk about its own students and fails to talk about like the histories of like people in diaspora, and fails to talk about Black people and Indigenous people and how they create the wealth of America today, you're really just allowing like a white supremacist like retelling of American history. Right. I mean, like the point that you said, like, oh, all my teachers is like, this is the first one that's not conservative. Like, that's a really important factor as well.
Yeah, definitely. It was something that I really, like, I didn't realize I needed it so bad until I had a teacher who was, like, willing to go off textbook and teach us everything. And again, like, and something else, too, like, I didn't, something that you said that reminded me of a class I took in college, and I wish I had the access to taking a class like this when I was younger. It was it was called Issues and Problems in American Society, and it was a social class at UCSC, and I took it literally the quarter after Trump was elected. So my freshman year, and I was like, ooh, this is gonna be a lot of hot takes in this class now. And in it, we were talking about, I had a really great TA for that class too, and we were talking about like school to prison pipeline and all of that, and then we're talking about like felon disenfranchisement and the way that it was like, again, like talking about Black Lives Matter and like a significant part of my life where I was like, oh my god, like, and I wish I had known this when I was younger, but it was talking about, and I'm not quoting anything particularly, so I hope this is like vaguely correct, but it was talking about how when you look at states that have prisons in them, very large maximum security, huge prisons that house and contain like a lot of people, like a lot of prisoners in them, a lot of those states have like lower populations, but those states' prisons add to the population of the entire state, right? So then in terms of like votes that they're given at the state, and the way that the population is reflected in their votes is increased by a lot, right? But the people who are in those prisons are not able to vote and not allowed to vote even after they leave, right? So when you look at how closely that parallels like the 3/5 compromise, it's like, oh, so you just did it again. Like it's not, this is not new. Like this is, none of this is new. And I think that's the first thing that I was like, that's such a horrible coincidence. And I was like, oh, it's not a coincidence. Like it was very much premeditated and very much like built to exist to continue the same system just under a different name. And I had never really put that connection together. And I was like, what, 18 years old by that point. So it's pretty upsetting that I didn't have the resources and tools, or at least that they weren't, you know, made very clearly available to me from a younger age. And when I heard that for the first time, I was like, oh my God, like that's just like that. It just opened up something about this entire movement, and it just made it so like, wow, like I'm disappointed, but I'm not surprised. And I think that's just been the sentiment that I've carried since. Yeah.
You know, like Black Lives Matter, like one thing I've noticed about it is it's very generational, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the folks that are out there organizing these protests are like
Mm-hmm.
in high school, right? And like I think that one thing that like we sort of fail our youth in our society is like Lexi, like you mentioned, like I didn't start learning about race things until like college, and it's like, yo, like kids can
Mm-hmm.
tell what race is. Like at a really young age, people can obviously see that there's a difference of people, and that there's a difference in how society views and treats people. There's no like too early time to talk about it, and you're right, like Solo, like it's taken up by like media, right? Like what media you consume then formulates the thoughts on like these communities. And I think a lot about how like our generations and even younger than that, right? Like we look on the news and we see the deaths of like Trayvon Martin um, and of other folks like Tamir Rice, like people our age, right? People that are like can be our classmates, or even the older folks that can be part of our community, and we grow up seeing that, right? And we have access to social media like Twitter, like Instagram, where, you know, like it's not like news media fabricating a particular perspective on riots, on marches, like folks showing like police brutality, granted, but it's also folks showing like the community that happens in Black Lives Matter. Like one of the things that they were saying was like with looting, right? Like they only show the looting part. They don't show the fact that people will like take groceries and resources out and then distribute it to the communities that have been structurally deprived of access in a pandemic. And when you grow up with that understanding, I feel like I have so much like love and faith for our you know, like generations, and like understanding the struggle and taking the need to go to the streets and making your voices being loud in that.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with everything everyone is saying all the time, forever. That is so much. It's interesting too, because I think that a lot of times, like when you're, you know, 18, 19, and you're just figuring out these huge like epiphany type things, like there is kind of a tendency to look inward and be like, how could I have not seen that? Like, how do I not know that already? When it's like the curriculum doesn't want you to know, right? Like people don't want you to know. People who own those prisons don't want you to know. And so it's like, it's not an individual problem, it's an institutional pandemic that makes it so people are unaware and thus continue these horrible practices. So yeah, I think I totally agree with that. And like Sarija was saying about, you know, sort of knowing things but not really knowing how to articulate them. I mean, I've had the privilege to go to college and research and learn things that were really important to me, like social justice. And so luckily I have the vocabulary now. But that's a privilege in and of itself, to be able to articulate your own oppression and the oppression that affects those around you. And so that's big. As far as the original question, I don't think there was like one moment where I was like, oh, like, yeah, it all connects, right? I think it was a lot of small moments of learning, learning in APUS history, like one page on Japanese internment, and growing up knowing that it was so much more, and then reflecting about how, I don't really think we talked about, the murder of Emmett Till, and I don't think we really talked about, all of the indigenous peoples who, have suffered and continue to suffer because of colonization. And so I think that was part of it. Another part, I think, was even though I identify really strongly as Japanese American, as opposed to Japanese, like a Japanese national, is that Japan did a lot of horrible colonization, occupation, just nasty things to countries like Korea and to like the Philippines and across Asia. And being able to recognize that it's like, yeah, like our lineage is part of the problem, right? Like we have helped perpetuate a lot of these things. So in order for us to, redeem isn't the right word, but in order for us to move forward, we need to be upfront about our own histories and what we are responsible for, and then fight for what we think is right now. Because like even though personally I didn't make those decisions to occupy other countries, it's like I can make decisions that either further or deter that kind of thinking, and if that is okay, right? But yeah, I really appreciate this conversation. I have a lot of feelings right now, especially being like in my grandpa's house with like all of our family pictures and stuff around. And yeah, I think this discussion is really needed and necessary, and I really encourage it, not only within our own ethnic communities, but like cross culturally like this, right? Because even though a lot of us may identify as API, I have a very different experience from MK and from Srija and from everyone else on this podcast. So it's really important that we are vocal and we flesh out some of these things.
We all work, we all do things on our own, and we all have like want to just unwind. Like I respect that you should unwind because there's a lot going on around the world, outside of the world, yada yada yada. But the fact that they're able to talk about it, they're able to at least address it and speak on their own behalf. It's kind of, it gives me like that peace of mind that I don't have to like ask you about what's going on. Like I feel like if you have to be asked by like, oh, how do you feel about the Black Lives Matter movement, and or if there's any questions about that, if you are silent, that's like an answer in itself. Silence also has a voice, and silence also has power, where it gives someone else the power as well. Does that mean, like if you're silent, then you're not speaking your own power. So that's why I think it's like frowned upon, and you should be held accountable for being silent because you have power. I'm more so speaking on this behalf of like, you should not be silent because you should be talking about these things, but also you have power within yourself, and it's your responsibility to find that power and speak on your behalf about what is going on. Yeah, how do y'all feel about that? Maybe that makes sense. I don't know if that makes sense. I'm like another tangent here. Hey.
No, that makes sense. I totally agree with you in terms of like your voice is your power. I think that's something we're all given a chance to use, and I feel like as someone who believes there's a purpose for everything, and is your key to what your purpose is. It's your way of showing support, love, also anger, because anger is a form of love, in which we get angry when things don't go our way, or when things are not right. And I think going back to the question of like, when did I start to care? I think I want to say media, which is like probably the worst tool right now, but it's also the best tool in which as a kid, like, you know, there's the mainstream media, or like shows, TV, movies, like they were all very white, and it was like, okay, that's cool. And some of those jokes I don't understand because I don't have, you know, those are not my experiences.
You know.
Right. Like, I'm sorry, I don't have a yacht that is in my backyard that I'm ready to take out, you know. I actually have a brother who's autistic. He's way older than me. So when we would play outside, my brother would he has this thing where he can't come back home, like he doesn't know how to get around. But there are times, you know, where we're not we're not watching him 24/7, so he'll slip out of the house. And a neighbor who at the time I didn't see color, which, you know, is very problematic right now, but like a neighbor came over and brought him over, and it was always like somebody like Black, somebody Latinx, or somebody Asian. Like, they knew that my brother was special, but also that where he lived, they knew where we lived, so they would bring him back. And I was like, that's what community looks like when you're able to see someone like, are you lost, like, come on, let's go home, I brought you home. Like, that to me was what community looked like. Versus like for my family in Samoa, they have more privilege in terms of like we're more high class, and they don't see what community looks like in this time and age here in the US. To elaborate more, I feel like the community I saw on TV, the community I saw growing up, looks different when you're at home on island. On island, we speak about village. We speak about how much it takes a village to raise a child. Well, my village extended from beyond this ocean, from beyond this land, this little island, and has been bigger because of the community that I lived in here. My village extends to my Black brothers and sisters out here, to the different folks I meet here in the hood or here in the struggle. Like, I feel like I've met strangers who understood what it meant to struggle and knew that you could count on them more than you could count on like some people that are related to you.
I don't know about
You know
that.
what I'm saying, you know?
There, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Like,
For sure.
you know, that American dream is so, like, that narrative is so real for some people in terms of like they internalize that, and then they like continue to praise the white savior. And I'm just like, American dream does not include us, nor will it ever. And you know, the American dream is built on Black bodies that are continuing to hurt to this very day, which, you know, a lot of people say slavery was a long time ago. No, slavery has evolved into what is now the prison system, and it's ugly, it's inhumane, and which is why like we should care. I mean, I feel like I owe a lot of support, a lot of freedom and liberty. Like, those words are in our national anthem, but they only show up for me in the community that has had my back. And it's been diverse, and that shows up a lot from Black minds, Black beautiful minds, that have fought this system, fought for freedom, fought for liberation, and fought for our rights to just do what we do every day. Like, I feel like we owe a lot to them, from just being able to go to a restaurant or to publicly like interact and be together in a public space, or even just like the different inventions that we've come across that white people have claimed, but really it wasn't them, you know. So yeah.
When I was younger, I would see all these kids who were, you know, like typically like South Asian, like young men who would, you know, wear like Yeezy, play rap songs in their car, and like really appreciate, or, you know, like kind of romanticize Black culture and take it on as something that they enjoyed, say the N-word, like be very problematic in the way that they talk about, you know, the Black community, and then they'd go home to their mansions like nothing was wrong, right? So like it was really frustrating to see them like co-opt and exercise their privilege in taking whatever parts of the culture that they saw was like fun and enjoyable for them, but do nothing to give back to the community or even take a second to appreciate that the origins of it were from a lot of times like suffering that allows for them to have the privilege to do these things. So I think seeing that was really frustrating growing up.
I liked your point, Shrija, a lot about like, here we are exchanging culture, but it's like, why can it not be this thing of like, yeah, let's share culture, like let's do that, but also like not play into like us trying to balance out these like racialized ideals of each other. Because I think like um you're right, like oftentimes like it is, I think that's a lot of times like the beauty of living in diverse communities right here in America and in a diaspora is getting that experience of other people's cultures. But when it's it's deep it's like deep in a particular way where literally white supremacy is categorizing and gendering these things, like we need to talk about that. And I think that that's sort of like the last question. So the name of the episode, right, is Black Lives Matter, Perspectives from the AAPI Community. We chose this title because some folks have been having discourse where it's like, don't just say like insert community for Black lives or like insert identity for Black lives. Like it should be a way of like, you don't always have to talk about yourself to then get people to care about Black people. I think there's a beauty in, of course, like, yeah, calling in your community for that, but then also not derailing from why did it take police brutality and the murder of the many members of the Black community for us to then think about these things, right? So what are some of the, what sort of like parting words, like what are some of the things that you would really encourage folks of your community to call in and analyze? Anyone can go.
I think similarly to what Srija was talking about of a spectrum of, you know, trying to meet in the middle, I think we need to be really cognizant and conscientious of how we're measuring our success, right? Like how are we measuring progress? Because if it's police reform, okay, right? If it's, you know, getting money, okay, but we, I think, really need to be aware of, you know, why would police reform be enough, right? Because ideally, right, like like reform would mean we wouldn't have to have firearms, right? Like we wouldn't have to use a lot of the strategies that are taught to police officers. And is that reform? Is the immunity, what I forget the term, but the immunity that police have to do certain things, you know, is that reform? Is it both? Right? I think that it's really important that we're asking, you know, why is that our measure of success? And ultimately, is that taking down structures of white supremacy, or is it another band-aid like so many other reforms before? And that's a really big question. And there are, you know, I don't know if, you know, there are no right answers, and it's definitely something we need to talk about, but we need to talk about it. And not only, you know, amongst our own community, but with other folks, with Black folks, with, you know, queer folks, with trans folks, with Desi folks, with Southeast Asian folks, like everyone, right? We all need to be part of that conversation, because ultimately, you know, if we're not dismantling structures of white supremacy, then I don't know if it's enough, right? So I think that that's what I would say, and that's a huge question, but it's definitely, I think, helped me to realign myself and my own actions as far as protesting and social media and financial contribution. I think it's helped me kind of recalibrate where I'm at. And so I hope discussions about it will hopefully, you know, lead people to determining what's best for themselves and what's best for their communities and their families.
I think what I want to address the most is maybe not the most, maybe it's just like one of the many things that I want to address is just like how Black Lives Matter is a movement that includes all of us. And yet when we say all lives matter, that is very exclusive. For my family members and my community members out there, if you want to have a conversation, and like I think Max said this before, be willing to be uncomfortable, be willing to find comfort in that uncomfortableness, and the harder conversations are always the ones that lead to a revolution, are always the ones that come from love. And like we've said before, shout out to Teresa Siangatonu and my girl and Matavai for really like speaking knowledge into our ocean, into our land, from our ancestors. Like that's the thing, like everything is written in the stars, so we got to look up, but we also got to stay grounded. And what that means for us, like how do we move forward, is having a conversation. Because I really do believe, sorry, I really do believe that a conversation can change a life. And this conversation is a part of the bigger conversation in my life of how do I continue to grow and help those around me, from Black all the way to white. I mean, you know, there's some good in a lot of us and there's some bad in a lot of us. But being able to find the vision and come to an understanding of what it means to coexist peacefully. And with peace comes a whole lot of hurt. So we're working on it. I think this conversation is very necessary, very essential to what it means to call in a lot of things that we've unlearned, but we need everyone else to unlearn as well.
Exactly. And I think to transition to my comment, as I said before, is like about revolutionary love and how we're all interconnected. Like, what's your kuleana? What's your responsibility? How are you going to hold yourself accountable to that responsibility? And how vulnerable are you willing to get when you're held accountable for that responsibility? Because when you become vulnerable, that is when you truly reveal how someone can comfort that vulnerability and vice versa. And through that is how you can express love, revolutionary love.
Exactly.
That being said, I think that's the first and foremost the only call out I have for my community, my family, my friends, my coworkers probably listen to this. So what's your responsibility?
Yes. Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, like, other than just being open to listening, which is hard sometimes, but it's also like, I feel like there's a lot of labor in, like, these conversations we have are so helpful and so beautiful because we come to a place where we are affirming ourselves in our purpose of moving towards liberation and freedom. But it's also hard. I think another calling for me is like, educate yourself, because I can do my work, but the emotional labor that it has for me to explain everything that you have access to, in resources, in research, in learning and unlearning, like, we can do this together, but we got to be on the same page. So you got to read like probably 500 more books before you get to my page.
I think that that's totally valid too, because like I think a lot about, you know, that sometimes folks on the internet are like, don't ask, like, don't ask Black people to explain like racism to you.
Right.
Like, you know, like, and like we, and like that's, it's valid, like it's valid, like you need to do that learning on your own, because like as we've talked about before, like our education system really fails to like bring these issues to light. But at the same time, like that doesn't mean then, oh, I have access to this Black person, let me just slide into their DMs and unlock a bunch of intergenerational trauma about slavery and about Jim Crow. Like that is a lot. And it's not, and like it's not okay to like almost like having like people to do that kind of labor for you, and that kind of like transactional, like teach me about your oppression, like that's you know, like that's also a part of the problem too. Is
just because it's like not convenient for you doesn't mean you should put that inconvenience on someone else. You should be comfortable with being inconvenient. I don't know about y'all and to other UCSC students especially, but we've been inconvenienced for the past, I don't know how long I've been here for 2 years. It's probably been longer than that, but every quarter has been an inconvenience to me. Honestly.
Say that. Say that. And make sure that you know, everyone who's listening, he said that with his chest, okay?
For everyone who was like, let me play devil's advocate real quick.
No. It's okay to be inconvenienced. If anything, if you are inconvenienced, that should be an opportunity to make yourself convenient for yourself and others.
And that goes back to what you said, Solo, of like, you have a responsibility. We all have a job to do. And in the native Hawaiian language, what was the word again?
Kuleana.
I think we all have a word that translates in some way into that. For Samoans and for Tongans, it's Tauhiva, and for Samoans, it's Geoliva or Tausiva. And in those words, like va meaning boat, Gausi or Geo meaning care for. So we're all in this journey of navigating life. But if we're not doing our job, if we're not taking responsibility of caring for the certain parts that we need to care to, we can't get across this ocean. So, I mean, it just goes a part of like, we each have a responsibility to hold ourselves and others accountable for everything that we do in this life, for everything that we say, for anything that we contribute to. It must come from a place of love, and in loving ourselves and those around us, we got to do the work. So that's on period.
So I think a lot of y'all, again, hitting on fantastic points of, don't start the conversation about if Black Lives Matter, start maybe about, why are you so defensive about whiteness? You know, what is your relationship to it? And go from there. What is your people's history to whiteness? And why do you think, or not why do you think, but why do we all think that it is okay that violence upon Black people is a structural thing that we participate in living in this country, right, as immigrants? I think one thing that came up that was really important through a conversation with a friend is like, you know, like the fact that Asian immigrants are even able to have their own communities, right, their own economic centers. Like, think about like Black Wall Street and how America didn't even allow that to happen. And so we particularly benefit from the white supremacy that is that is exuded through capitalism, right? So yeah, put your money where it is. Put that the privilege it has to have these conversations and take it step by step, because you are doing a lot of unlearning for a lot of people, and understand that like folks in your communities are not a monolith, right? Like obviously we've been talking before, like if you are maybe come from immigrant background but are incredibly wealthy, of course that's going to be a different understanding and a different proximity to whiteness than as someone who comes from an immigrant community but is maybe working class or maybe queer, right? And so all of these points are super valid, and conversations are just the scratch of surface to the real work that needs to be done, right? And so I really want to thank y'all for participating in this conversation, and to create this kind of content for folks to consume, because we are right, like media will continue to pass off Black Lives Matter until unfortunately the death of another Black person occurs, or the scene, or the sort of like yeah, just like until something sensational happens again. And like you can't wait for the sensationalization of violence to motivate you to do these things, because the violence is every day, right? So thank you so much for participating. I really appreciate y'all and your conversation and your time. I know this has been like a long time coming for the podcast to be published. So I, again, appreciate that all. And thank you, Mel, for being tech support.